On February 11, 1990, the world held its breath. A 71-year-old man, after 27 long years in prison, walked free into the sunlight. That man was Nelson Mandela. But this was no simple homecoming. South Africa was a racial powder keg, a nation teetering on the brink of a bloody civil war. The white minority government was losing its grip, and the oppressed black majority was demanding justice. The world expected the man who emerged from that prison to be a figure of vengeance, a hardened revolutionary ready to burn down the system that had stolen his life. Instead, he became an architect of peace. To understand how this was possible, we must first understand the code that was forged not in the halls of power, but inside the brutal walls of a prison cell. Before the prisoner, there was the rebel. The young Nelson Mandela was a fiery lawyer and a leading activist in the African National Congress, or ANC. For years, he advocated for non-violent protest against the monstrous system of apartheid, a brutal state-enforced policy of racial segregation and oppression. But after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, where police opened fire on peaceful black protesters, Mandela's perspective shifted. He concluded that non-violence was a failed strategy against a regime that only responded to force. He co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, or Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC. He went underground, studying the tactics of guerrilla warfare and sabotage. At this stage, Mandela was not a symbol of peace. He was a revolutionary who believed in armed struggle as the necessary response to a violent state. In 1962, he was captured, and 2 years later, at the Rivonia trial, he and his comrades were sentenced to life in prison for plotting to overthrow the government. He was sent to the most notorious prison in South Africa, Robben Island. It was a place designed not just to confine, but to break the human spirit. Prisoners were forced into hard labor, breaking rocks under a blinding sun. They were subjected to constant humiliation and stripped of their identity, reduced to a number. For Mandela, that number was 46664. But it was here, in this crucible of suffering, that his transformation began. He made a conscious decision. This would not be a prison, it would be a university. This was the first principle of his code, to turn a tool of oppression into an instrument of liberation. The first part of his education was to understand his enemy. Mandela began the long, arduous process of learning Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors. This was not a gesture of submission, it was a strategic masterstroke. By speaking their language, he could understand their culture, their history, their literature, and most importantly, their fears. He read their poetry and studied their history, realizing that the Afrikaner people also saw themselves as victims, a tribe that had been oppressed by the British. He decoded their psyche, understanding that their brutal system was built not just on hate, but on a deep-seated fear of being annihilated. This understanding would become his most powerful weapon in the years to come. Inside the prison, he forged a government in exile. He organized the political prisoners, creating a system of secret education where inmates would teach each other literature, history, and political science. They held debates, formulated policy, and turned a disparate group of rebels into a disciplined and unified political force, ready to govern. This became known as the Mandela University. It was a clandestine operation of incredible resilience. Younger, more radical prisoners would arrive, full of rage and ready for violent confrontation. Mandela, the elder statesman, would patiently mentor them. He taught them that the struggle was not just about fighting the guards, but about preparing to govern a country. He emphasized discipline, education, and the importance of understanding the very system they sought to replace. But his greatest struggle was internal. He spent years conquering his own anger, his own desire for revenge. Through incredible self-discipline, he tamed his own spirit, realizing that he could not lead a nation to peace if he was still at war with himself. He was mastering the art of forgiving the unforgivable, not for his captor's sake, but for his own, and for the future of his country. By the late 1980s, the world had changed. The apartheid government was a global pariah, crippled by international sanctions and facing increasing unrest at home. They knew their system was unsustainable. Secret talks began between the government and Mandela, who was still a prisoner. And it was here that his 27 years of study paid off. He negotiated not as a desperate captive, but as a leader in waiting. His calm authority, his unwavering principles, and his profound understanding of his opponent's fears allowed him to control the negotiations. He wasn't just arguing for his own freedom, he was meticulously laying the groundwork for the peaceful dismantling of apartheid and the transfer of power to a democratic government. The government tried to offer him conditional freedom multiple times, hoping to neutralize him politically. In 1985, President P.W. Botha offered to release him if he would renounce armed struggle. From his prison cell, Mandela's refusal was read to the world by his daughter. He powerfully stated, "What freedom am I being offered while the organization of the people remains banned? Only free men can negotiate. A prisoner cannot enter into contracts." This masterful move turned the government's offer against them, exposing their hypocrisy and cementing his status as the unwavering leader of his people, even while in chains. His release in 1990 did not bring peace. It brought the country to the edge of the abyss. Violence erupted between rival black factions and white supremacist groups. A full-scale civil war seemed inevitable. This was Mandela's greatest test. He had to hold the nation together with his moral authority alone. He preached reconciliation when many of his own people screamed for revenge. He called for peace when the drums of war were beating their loudest. The ultimate application of his code came in 1995, during the Rugby World Cup, which was being held in South Africa. Rugby and the national team, the Springboks, had been a hated symbol of white supremacist culture. Mandela, now president, knew that to unite the country, he had to embrace the symbol of its division. He famously met with the team's captain, had tea with the man who had presided over his imprisonment, and on the day of the final, he walked onto the field wearing a Springbok jersey. It was a gesture that stunned the world and shattered the racial divide. The moment was electric, as Mandela, a black man who had been imprisoned by the apartheid regime, stood in the middle of a stadium filled predominantly with white rugby fans, wearing their team's colors. The entire stadium erupted. Decades of hatred and division seemed to melt away in a single, thunderous chant of his name. Nelson, Nelson. It was more than a sporting event. It was a national catharsis. He had taken his enemy's most cherished symbol and made it a symbol of unity for all South Africans. It was a political masterstroke that no amount of legislation could ever achieve. A country was saved. Those 27 years in prison were not lost time. They were the furnace that burned away the fiery rebel and forged a master strategist, a political genius, and a global icon of peace. The prison cell was his university, his laboratory, and his monastery. It was where he learned that the only way to truly defeat your enemy is to understand them, and that forgiveness is not a sign of weakness, but the ultimate act of power. He used his confinement to master himself, so that one day he could be the master of a nation's destiny. And that is the architecture of the code of Nelson Mandela. Remember, history is more than a story. It's a code, and there is always another layer to decrypt. Subscribe and continue the investigation with us.